Hi, welcome back. This is the part 2 of our series on verbal communication under the employability skills course. In the part 1, we had seen about opening communication, reinforcement, and effective listening. We had seen how we should open the communication and what should be our verbal and non-verbal gestures to aid in the communication process, and how reinforcement can have an impact in terms of creating the correct environment and supporting the speaker as well as the group. We also saw how effective listening was a very important skill, and we need to train ourselves to effective listening, and we need to use our listening skills to aid the communication process. In this part, we would be seeing the skills of questioning, summarizing, and closing communication. This would then conclude our series on verbal communication. Questioning is a very important and effective skill. However, unfortunately, it is not used by many. It is something which we are trained to right from when we are a child. As a child, we are used to questioning about a lot about everything to our caregivers and parents. However, as we grow older, sometimes we stop the questioning aspect. Questioning can be used to obtain information. It can be used to start a conversation. It can be used to test understanding. It can be used to draw someone into a conversation, or show interest in a person, or program, or service, or product. It can be used to seek support or agreement. Questioning can be used by every member in the communication process, be it the speaker or the listener or the evaluator. And it is a very vital tool in the hands of the communicator when you are in roles that are front facing in an organization, especially in service or sales, because it helps improve your understanding levels and accurately map the requirement so that you can make an adequate response. Questioning is of two types. First is the closed-ended questions, and the second is the open-ended question. Closed-ended questions elicit yes or no answers. They are short, sweet questions where the speaker or the questioner induces or pushes the respondent in a particular direction, so that the person who uses closed-ended question can guide the conversation. Questions should be: did you reach the office on time? Did you reach the in the meeting location on time? It can only give you two answers: either it's yes or no. If it is yes, the next question would be: did your collaborators reach on time? So, in a sense, closed-ended questions would prevent diffusion of the focus, so that the speaker can guide the conversation and control the communication. Typically, while you are in a service or a sales situation, and in the initial part of the situation where you are exploring the situation and are trying to understand the situation, you use more of open-ended questions. While once you have understood it, if you want to take it to the logical conclusion or logical or a direction that you direction path that you think is right, you start using closed-ended questions so that you can direct the communication and guide the conversation. Also, if there are specific understanding that you want about a particular aspect, their closed-ended questions would be more appropriate. And closed-ended questions will also help you to drive the engagement towards desired outcomes, specifically in sales situations and in service situations. Some of the examples of closed-ended questions, as we had mentioned in our note, could also be: did you check the exam papers yesterday? Did you watch the latest episode of Indian Idol on Colors yesterday? Or of did you watch Kapil's show on the television yesterday? Coming to open-ended questions, they are meant to further discussion and elaboration. It is meant to engage the listener into speaking out and speaking more. It is here where the conversation from the questioner's end is short, while that from the person being questioned is or answering is longer. There is a scope for self-expression, there is a scope for explanation, there is a high level of scope for involvement, and there is a scope of emotional connect between the questioner and the person who is answering. This also gives an opportunity to seek elaborate information and not specific information, as was the case in the closed-ended questions. For example, when you ask somebody, how was your travel when you came into this location this morning? It could include anything under the sky, what the customer or what the individual felt or heard and or saw, and not necessarily what information you were seeking. For example, if you wanted to know whether the signal at a particular junction was working, you ask a closed-ended question saying, was the signal at junction B working today, or was it not working? However, if it's an open-ended question, you simply ask him about his travel experience and he goes on. He may touch upon the prevailing situation at that junction or may not. So that probably would give you a basic differential feel between the two options of closed-ended and open-ended questions. Both are important, both have their own role, and it is an art to be able to use both open-ended and closed-ended question so that you can arrive at the desired outcomes and guide the conversation through the proper path. Once you have learnt questioning, the next aspect which is important in verbal communication is reflecting and clarifying. Reflecting and clarifying are probably similar in nature, and they essentially are a feedback to the speaker. Reflecting would basically be like a paraphrasing of the message, where a feedback is sent, is given to the speaker about your understanding of what has been said. It is a very specialized skill in certain professions. For example, counselors and psychologists would need high level of skill sets of this nature, of reflecting nature, so that they are able to communicate well in their context. However, reflecting can also be used in all other communication contexts and is a very useful skill to learn. It actually captures the essence of the facts and feelings that you can express and communicate back to the speaker. You basically express what you have understood in the conversation or the situation, and hence the speaker gets to know how the message was received and whether the communication was complete. Is there any clarification that he needs to add post that? Is there any loss of communication which has happened? Also, it reflecting and clarifying is a way of demonstrating that you are actually actively evaluating and considering the speaker's viewpoint, and it's not that you're dogmatic or you are prejudiced. And if there are points of concern or points where you disagree, probably you will make a hint here, giving the speaker an opportunity to express himself or herself further, and hence try to ensure that the communication goes in a direction that he intended. After the reflection, you're almost towards the end of the communication, but typically before the communication ends, there needs to be a summarizing step. Whether you are in a sales situation or service situation or teaching situation, an interviewing situation, or a reviewing situation, you need to have a short summarizing event where the difference between reflecting and summarizing would be that in summarizing, both the parties would be involved. Both the speaker as well as the listener are involved, and they review each other's point of view and agree on the communication exchange. So there would be a consensus at the end of summarizing step regarding the outcomes of the communication exercise. The last step in verbal communication, of course, is closing the communication. We started with opening communication. Closing communication is as important, because as the opening communication ensured that there would be the first impression, the closing communication is involved with memories, and it is very important that you close well. Closing communication would involve both verbal and non-verbal aspects. Usually the impact of the communication process and the event would many a time reflect in non-verbal communication, and you need to proactively manage that so that you do not send the wrong signals, and you are professional in your approach in terms of having a very formal closing in formal settings. You may allow emotions to outburst in informal and personal settings, but certainly not in formal settings. While closing, please do not be abrupt. You ensure that the summarizing aspect has taken place, and the closing, of course, could involve subtle and not so subtle signals, but it could involve a physical handshake, stand up, clapping, and commendation of the presentation done. But just ensure that you're not very abrupt. An important aspect which needs to be taken care while you're closing is that it's an opportunity for you to make future arrangements in terms of the future meetings, in terms of feedback, in terms of when the other person needs to be contacted, by whom and in what way, so that the dialogue or discussion process, the engagement process, can be continued. With this, we come to the end of the part 2 of verbal communication. In the verbal communication process, we have seen basically 6 aspects. Firstly, opening of the communication, reinforcement, effective listening, questioning, summarizing, and closing communication. So while it is an elaborate process, it usually can become your second nature with practice and constant improvement. Good luck with that. Thank you for joining us in this presentation on verbal communication. Do go through the other videos and modules that we have on employability skills. Thank you.